There are so many events in America's rich history that allows us to be the states we are today. We can attribute much of society to specific times in which a change in U.S. history has happened for the better. I present to you Turning Points in U.S. History. Before slave codes, there weren't any regulations on how slave masters could treat their slaves. Technically, slaves were considered the master's property. The life of slaves varied immensely. Some slaves lived in small shacks and were given inedible food. These slaves might have had cruel overseers who would hurt them to ensure they were on task. Other slaves, such as domestic slaves, were given better food and a better life. After the slave codes were set throughout the southern states, slaves were treated similarly on every plantation in each individual state. An example from South Carolina slave codes is, slaves were forbidden to leave the owner's property unless they were accompanied by a white person. These codes did not do much to help the slaves, but set a regulation on the definition of slavery in America.
Before the Civil War, some African Americans actually weren't slaves at all. Some escaped, while others were set free by the voluntary emancipation by the slave owner, or through their master's will. Either way, these freed slaves weren't given the same rights as their European counterparts. Laws in states were passed that prohibited the teaching of blacks to read or write, preach the Bible, testify in court, etc. Nonetheless, these African Americans were highly skilled and helped set a foundation for the African American culture today. After the turning point of the Civil War, when all African Americans became free, life for all African Americans changed. These African Americans began to read and write, study and preach their religion, as well as create great inventions that can be seen in America today. The separation between African Americans decreased greatly due to the fact that they were all placed under the same oppression. The Alien and Sedition Acts is another primary source that is a turning point in American history. We can read the Alien and Sedition Acts today. Those laws prohibited people from protesting the government and increased the difficulty of the immigration process. Previously, immigrants in America were eligible to vote after 5 years of being a U.S. citizen. These laws raised this to 14 years. The effect of the Alien and Sedition Acts showed that American citizens were not going to stand down to government authority. The Sedition Act clearly violated protections under the First Amendment of the Constitution. Strong Federalists such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would oppose these new laws in state legislatures. Virginia and Kentucky legislators passed resolutions clearing the laws unconstitutional and ignored them. The Kentucky legislature rejected the federal law in total. We can see the beginning of protests of the government from these acts today.
Before 1830, there was no such thing as art museums open to the public. An American union was created to raise money for artist salaries. One artist was Thomas Cole. Before this turning point, artists only painted portraits of people. But Thomas Cole, who had no formal training as an artist, decided to paint the landscape of America. He, along with many other artists, were influenced by European artists and writers. After this turning point, it became common to see paintings over the fireplace in homes. The invention of a precursor to the photograph, called the daguerreotype, caused a demand for more paintings. Middle-class people became more excited about art. The Hudson River School of Artists and many other art unions contributed to the artistic society we have today. They are why today in buildings and homes art is commonplace. They are why contemporary art museums are popular all around the U.S. The Second Great Awakening from 1975 to 1835 was another turning point in U.S. history. Reverend Charles Grandison Finney was the first to speak about how man can achieve his own salvation. He preached that God is not angry. God is merciful and loving. Therefore, go forth and do as well as believe. Before this religious revival, many people believed that God was an angry judge and humans were sinners. Preachers scared their congregation into worshiping God. After this religious revival, people had a new understanding of Christianity and other religions. Many religions are built on the belief that God loves everyone and is all-forgiving. Before the beginning of the benevolent empire, institutions did not cooperate to form a general Christian vision that supported national greatness and individual moral. In urban areas, religious people began to make commitments to anti-slavery. There was a call for moral reform, which seemed to intrude on private family matters for those who benefited from the Industrial Revolution. The formation of the Benevolent Empire called for working men's associations that could secure higher wages for ordinary laborers. After the formation of the Benevolent Empire, groups such as the American Bible Study, American Sunday School Union, and the American Tract Society organized on a national scale. This is a photograph of the 1825 headquarters of the American Tract Society, an organization that was devoted to spreading the good word. Today, we see the Benevolent Empire in our society. Many people across the United States study the same religion and work together to spread their beliefs. The Trail of Tears is a debatable turning point in U.S. history. Before the Trail of Tears, when Andrew Jackson became president, Native Americans lived all across America on their ancestral lands. Different tribes lived in different areas where they were proud to be who they were. Then, President Jackson forced all of these natives to be moved to secluded reservation camps west of the Mississippi River. The Native Americans suffered from Andrew Jackson's vision of America. They were removed from their ancestral lands and were relocated to make room for settlers and speculators who made large profits from the purchase and sale of the land they were previously on. Some believe that the Trail of Tears was good for the natives because they were removed out of the way of the Europeans, which they often came in conflict with. Others, including the Native Americans themselves, say that the Trail of Tears was unfair and ripped the natives from their ancestry. The topic is still up to debate in America today. Another major turning point in history was prison and asylum reform. This is a turning point because before the reform, the sick and insane did not have mental institutions but were stuck in prisons with actual criminals. Dorothea Dix was one of the outspoken females against the unjust treatment of the mentally ill. She went to Europe and pleaded for mental hospitals there, as well as created the first psychiatric hospital in America. After the reform, prisons broke off into many different sections rather than grouping every wrongdoer into one building. Juvenile detention centers were built for children. Prison libraries, the reduction of whipping and beating, the separation of men and women, children, and the sick began. This form of confinement is the same system used in America today. The Canal Era is yet another major turning point in history. Before canals, there was no form of far transportation across the U.S. Only trailblazers and homesteaders, followed by wagon, could bring their possessions with them to the West. For hundreds of years, people thought of the idea of building a canal across New York that connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River to New York City to the Atlantic Ocean. People couldn't seek government assistance. A man named Dwight Clinton was the first to successfully petition the New York legislature to build the canal to bring the dream to reality. This turning point allowed for large-scale grain farming to begin from the flatlands in the West. The canals enabled the farmers to send their goods to New England. Many farmers from the North left their jobs for ones in factories. Flatboats and steamboats were invented. We can still see the effects of the canal era today. The development of early railroads was one of the most important phenomena of the Industrial Revolution. The American railroads brought economic and political change to America. The Mohawk and Hudson Railroad reduced the 40-mile canal trip that took all day to accomplish to a 17-mile trip that took less than an hour. Railroads dropped the cost of shipping by 60 to 70%. America began building their own railroads and engines on their own money raised from the federal government. Here is an image of the money that the Baltimore, Ohio Railroad Company raised for construction. In only 12 days, the company raised over $4 million. Before the Louisiana Purchase, America only occupied the east of the vast land that we call the United States today. Most of the West was owned by Napoleon Bonaparte of France. Napoleon threatened to block the New Orleans port of the Mississippi River from America, which made President Jefferson consider changing his traditional foreign policies to an anti-French alliance with the British. Rather than doing this, he bargained with France for access to the Mississippi River and eventually purchased the territory that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains for about 4 cents an acre. The deal was struck in 1803. This investment doubled the size of the United States. Jefferson did not follow the Constitution, which made Federalist critics angry. Nonetheless, the purchase was an important one that is seen in the United States today. Without the Louisiana Purchase, America would have only occupied the East and possibly crumbled due to the blockage of the important New Orleans port. The Industrial Revolution was a transformation from an agricultural to the industrial economy. This transformation took over a century. The first industrial mill was opened in 1970 by Samuel Slater. He borrowed this design from a British model. The outwork system was another key part of the American Industrial Revolution. Small parts of a large production process were carried out by numerous people in individual homes. Eventually, when the factory system began, the production process was performed large-scale in a centralized location. Farm girls were recruited to operate machines in factories. The Industrial Revolution was a turning point for many reasons. Wage labor began to rise, the system of credit expanded, and the transportation system was improved. The Canal Era and early American railroads were all products of the Industrial Revolution. Transportation was crucial for raw materials to reach factories. Here is a drawing that depicts men working on the lock section of the Erie Canal, one of the most popular canals built during the Industrial Revolution. We can see the Industrial Revolution today. As you can see, there were many events in American history that contribute to the melting pot that our society is today.